Here's the big development that's taken place. The Chinese President Xi Jinping and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have had a telephonic conversation over the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And this, remember, is the first phone call between President Xi and the Ukrainian president ever since the war began. Ukraine said that the appointment of an ambassador to Beijing would give a powerful impetus to the development of the bilateral relations. China has also confirmed the conversation, saying it has always stood on the side of peace. Significantly, Beijing has so far shown a neutral stance on the Russian invasion and never condemned the war in Ukraine. The conversation comes at a time when Xi Jinping visited Russia last month for 2 days and proposed a 12-point peace plan for the ongoing conflict.
This phone call between the two heads of state comes at a time when the Ukraine crisis is dragging on and even escalating with spillovers continuing to emerge. Most countries are worried that there are growing calls of peace and reason for ceasing hostilities. China always stands on the side of peace on the Ukraine issue, is a staunch advocate of political solutions and promoter of peace talks. Xi Jinping pointed out that the complex and evolving crisis in Ukraine has a significant impact on the international situation. On the issue of the Ukrainian crisis, China has always stood on the side of peace, and its core position is to encourage peace talks. The actions taken by the Chinese side are open and above board. Dialogue and negotiation are the only viable way out. There is no winner in a nuclear war. When dealing with nuclear issues, all parties involved should remain calm and exercise restraint, and should truly consider their own future and that of all humanity, and work together to manage the crisis.
Reactions of other countries such as the United States and of course Russia are still awaited. But let's try and get in a sense of perspective, because this is a big development. Let's try and weigh in on that. I'm joined in by Edward P. Joseph, who's an EU political affairs expert, and joining me live from Washington, D.C. Many thanks to you, Edward, for joining in. Now, Zelensky has hailed this phone call, but his emphasis remains on Ukraine's bilateral relations with China, one he hopes to achieve through the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China. Would you see this phone call as a step in the right direction?
Akansha, great to be with you here and to be with your viewers. This is a very important phone call, not for the content, certainly not the content that we are aware of that's been publicly released. What's important is that this phone call happened, that President Xi of China phoned and spoke with and had a cordial, by all reports and indications, a cordial phone call and respectful phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Why? Why is it that it's so important? Because that's a form of Chinese recognition. It's a form of Chinese recognition of the legitimacy of Ukraine and the legitimacy of President Zelensky, who, of course, we know has become the face of Ukraine's struggle, its struggle to maintain its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its democracy against Russian aggression. And that step in and of itself, the fact that President Xi made this phone call and held this phone call, is acknowledgement of that. It's a signal to Russia as well that President Zelensky and Ukraine are a factor that they are going to have to deal with. And we know this, Akanksha, we know this by the Russian reaction. The Russian reaction, where the statement from the foreign ministry was that any initiatives for peace, like Chinese initiatives for peace, are unlikely to be adequately received by, here are the key words, puppets controlled by Washington. We know that in President Xi's eyes, President Zelensky cannot be a puppet controlled by Washington, because if he were, President Xi would never have made the phone call. So that's the important point here. It's that China has signaled that President Zelensky and Ukraine are, in fact, a legitimate factor that Russia is going to have to deal with, even though Russia doesn't want that, and even though China, of course, backs Russia in this conflict.
That's a very significant observation made by you, Edward. What do you make of the timing of this long-awaited phone call, especially when it was expected to take place last month? Could a strong Ukrainian counteroffensive now have a role to play in this phone call?
That's part of it. That could be part of it. But I believe the real driver here is a political one. Let's remember what China's strategy is here. Its overall goal. It wants to assert itself. China wants to assert itself in Asia against other. It wants to be the dominant power in Asia and around the globe, including with respect to a country like India. So, and China sees as its foremost obstacle to that the United States, and it sees the U.S. relationship with its European Union and NATO allies as a key element, standing in China's aspirations to dominate Asia and dominate the world. So it wants to break that, and it knows. And it recently received. It had this visit by President Macron of France,
Right.
and that was responded to by a controversial remark by the Chinese ambassador to France, who suggested that some of these countries, post Berlin Wall countries, are not real countries. And this created a huge
I'm going
problem
to
for
delve
China.
deeper into that aspect. You know, that is one aspect that deserves a whole different question, which I am going to come to. Edward, just hours ago at the UN, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has blamed the West for a deadlock over the Black Sea grain deal. Is Moscow now buckling under pressure due to restrictions on payments, logistics, and insurance, which they claim are being a barrier to shipments?
The larger problem here is political, and what we see is that Russia is looking for every way to try to get out of this grain deal. They've invoked and threatened to back out of the grain export deal, which is so important because it is Russia that is preventing Ukraine's grain going onto the global market, which is so important for so many countries. Another consequence of this unprovoked Russian aggression. And they have threatened, Russia has threatened to cut off this grain deal if the G7 go forward with sanctions, expanding sanctions and export controls on Russia at the meeting in Japan next month. They've linked this to that. This is the type of food blackmail that Russia plays with. And this is why all countries need to understand what's going on here. No country, including the United States, wants this war to continue. Edward, it's terrible for the Ukrainian people, terrible for the world, the global economies. But the only way to get through it is to recognize who is the aggressor and to isolate Russia. Only by isolating and pressuring Russia will we advance the cause of getting a rapid conclusion to the war. Please.
Right. Edward, I'm sorry to interrupt because I have a host of questions awaiting your attention. So since you're talking about the political ramifications of this, earlier this month, the EU chief and the French president also were in Beijing to meet the Chinese president. While Macron did receive flack for his views on the US foreign policy, are von der Leyen and Macron to be credited for this new beginning?
No, I wouldn't credit this at all for President Macron. This was a setback, and I should point out here it was not well received even in France. Even in France, what President Macron suggested in China, what was not well received, in this concept of continuing to talk about this need for strategic autonomy of Europe. No one more than the United States would like Europe to be more self-sufficient in the sphere of defense than the United States. It's been the United States that's been pushing these countries in Europe, NATO allies, to stand up for themselves and to develop the defenses that they need. So these are hollow words. They're damaging because they came in China after President Xi had gone and had this 3-day visit of total support for President Putin and this aggressive war in China. And here's another key point for viewers in Asia in particular, is that China's position on this war is completely hypocritical. China's entire foreign policy, even its domestic policy, is based on the sanctity of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, what do we have in Ukraine?
Okay,
We
so
have a clear
since you're
case
talking
of a
about
member of the United
you're
Nations
talking
that's
about
been attacked.
China's hypocritical stance, since Beijing's peace plan is also being viewed as one heavily tilted in favor of Moscow, what should be Kiev's concerns?
Well, it turns out in the phone call, actually, it apparently, according to reports, there was not much discussed about the peace plan, and there was not much even said about it.
Right, but what
even
should
in
be
the
Kiev
Chinese
concerned
readout.
about? Should Kiev even trust Beijing?
Well, this is any country would be in dealings with China would be quite foolish to be trusting of China. But you have to have eyes wide open with China. I think any country, certainly in Asia, would know that you need to have eyes wide open when it comes to China. But again, what the reports indicate, even the Chinese readout of this phone call suggests that the actual terms of some peace plan were not a big feature in the phone call. And President Zelensky does not suggest that this was a big topic. China and President Xi wants to present themselves as some kind of peacemaker, but this peace plan is mostly rhetoric. It's empty. It doesn't deal with concrete issues that are at stake, and it doesn't appear that they really delved into that into a serious way. So that's again, what's most important here is that this phone call happened, and that
All right.
President Xi felt that he had to do it in large part to calm and try to protect China's relationship in Europe, which has been so damaged recently by these very controversial remarks by the Chinese ambassador.
And that's why I'd like to
Please.
quote another European leader. In an interview to Politico, the Czech president has said that China is benefiting from the war because not only can it push Russia into concessions, but also ensure that the West and US are weakened through spending on the war. Do you agree that China has vested interest in a prolonged war?
Definitely. That the Czech ambassador is absolutely correct. The Czech official who said that is absolutely correct.
The Czech president, in fact.
China is benefiting from this war. So all those countries in Asia and around the world that are so concerned about this should know and see China for what it is, a very self-interested, cynical player here. Absolutely. Look at the relationship with China. They have President Putin, this failed leader, leading basically a corrupt, weak enterprise, nothing like this grand strategist that everyone thought he was before this war. He's basically on his knees begging China for help. That's very good for China. China has its own issues, would like to project power into parts of Russia as well. So that part is very good. And yes, the US, again, China's primary preoccupation. China is obsessed with advancing its interests in Asia and around the world against what it sees as the U.S. is holding its back. And China knows that the U.S., even U.S. ammunition stocks, which
now
could
I'd
be
like
and
to,
need to be going to Taiwan, are being depleted. Please.
I'm so sorry, Edward, to interrupt you. I need to wrap up. But my last question before I let you go, here's where I'd like to ask about the Chinese ambassador to France. Can China's position on the war be trusted when its own ambassador to France shocks the world by stating that former Soviet republics do not have a current status in international law, especially when asked about his position on the annexation of Crimea?
Absolutely not. What country could trust China, and particularly those that are in Europe and in Eastern Europe after such a remark? No country, you'd be foolish to trust China when you hear a remark like that. You see how China trying to get around this problem that it has with sovereignty and territorial integrity. Let's remember, Ukraine is a member of the United Nations with internationally recognized borders that Russia has unilaterally violated, and China is supporting that. So how can China claim that sovereignty is so this sacred position? It cannot, and this Chinese ambassador in France has attempted here to try to circumvent all of that, and in so doing created big political problems for President Xi, and that's, again, another factor why this phone call happened today.
All right. Many thanks to you, Edward, for joining in with your precious insights. It's always been a pleasure to speak to you as it was today.